Welcome, weary traveler, to a quiet space just for you. As you settle in, let go of the day's burdens. Feel the soft cushions beneath you, the gentle weight of the blankets over you. The air around you is still, and the world outside has faded into a hushed murmur. Close your eyes and take a deep, slow breath. Inhale the calm, and as you exhale, release all tension, all worry, all the noise that clutters the mind. With each breath, feel your shoulders soften, your jaw unclench, your eyelids grow heavy. You are drifting now, floating on a gentle current of peace. We are about to journey back in time, to a place where the dawn of civilization was written in clay and carved in stone. There is no rush, no destination to reach, only a story to unfold. Let the ancient whispers guide you, and as they do, surrender to the gentle pull of sleep. In the beginning, long before the great pyramids rose from the sands of Egypt or the philosophers of Greece debated in their sun-drenched courtyards, there was a land nestled between two rivers. It was a place of astonishing contrasts, a barren, sun-baked landscape transformed by the life-giving waters that flowed through it. This was Mesopotamia, a name that, in Greek, means the land between the rivers. But it was more than just a place on a map. It was the cradle of human civilization, a crucible where the very foundations of our modern world were forged. To understand this incredible story, we must first travel back to a time so ancient that the world was still wild and untamed. The first glimmerings of what we call civilization didn't start with grand cities or powerful empires, but with a quiet, revolutionary change in how people lived. Imagine a world where every day was a hunt, a struggle for survival. Early humans roamed in small nomadic bands, following the movements of animals and the changing seasons, their lives dictated by the whims of nature. They lived in caves or temporary shelters, their existence precarious and their future uncertain. But then, a profound shift occurred. It was not a single moment, but a long, slow dawning of an idea. For generations, people had observed the natural world with a keen eye, watching seeds sprout from the earth and plants flourish in the sun. They began to realize that they could stop being just passive observers and become active participants in this cycle of life. This realization, simple as it sounds, was a complete paradigm shift. It was the birth of agriculture, the moment when humanity decided to put down roots. In Mesopotamia, this change was particularly dramatic. The land, though naturally arid, was blessed with the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Their annual floods, much like the Nile in Egypt, brought down rich, fertile silt from the mountains, depositing it across the plains. It was a natural gift, a bounty waiting to be harnessed. But to truly unlock its potential, people had to learn to control the water. This was no small feat. It required coordination, planning, and a level of cooperation that nomadic life had never demanded. So they began to build. Simple ditches at first, then more complex canals, guiding the precious river water to their fields of wheat and barley. This innovation was the spark that ignited everything else. With a reliable source of food, people no longer had to spend their entire day hunting and gathering. They could settle in one place, and as a result, their communities grew. A single family's hut became a small village, which in turn grew into a town. The need to manage these new, larger communities led to the creation of social structures, of leaders, and of rules. The simple act of planting a seed led inevitably to the birth of society itself. Now picture this early landscape. It's not a bustling metropolis, but a collection of small villages, their mud brick houses clustered together. The air hums with the sound of life, children playing, the lowing of livestock, the quiet rhythm of farming. But as these villages grew, something new and complex emerged. With a surplus of food, not everyone had to be a farmer. Some could specialize. One person might become a potter, another a weaver, another a builder. This division of labor was a huge step forward. It led to more efficient production of goods and allowed for the development of new skills and technologies. For the first time, people weren't just surviving. They were building, creating, and innovating. This era of prehistory and early history is often referred to as the Ubaid period, a time that saw the first truly large-scale settlements in southern Mesopotamia, particularly in the region later known as Sumer. The people of the Ubaid culture were remarkable for their pottery, beautifully painted with geometric designs, and for their sophisticated understanding of irrigation. They laid the groundwork for everything that was to follow. They built the first monumental buildings, likely temples, which served as a focal point for their communities. These were not just places of worship, they were also centers of administration and economic activity. The temple became the heart of the city, and the priests who served in it became powerful figures managing the community's surplus resources and overseeing the construction of public works. The transition from these early settlements to the first true cities was a gradual but monumental process. A city is more than just a large village. It is a complex society with a government, a stratified social structure, and a sophisticated economy. The first place this happened, as far as we know, was in Mesopotamia. The name of the city is Uruk. Uruk was a true marvel, a sprawling urban center that, at its peak, was home to tens of thousands of people. It was a place of immense power and complexity, with monumental temples, massive walls, and a bustling population of artisans, merchants, and laborers. The rise of Uruk and other Sumerian city-states marks a pivotal moment in human history. It was here that many of the things we take for granted today were invented or developed. Writing, for instance, didn't come into being because someone wanted to write a poem or a history book. It was born out of necessity, out of the need to keep track of things. The massive temples and palaces were collecting and redistributing huge amounts of goods, grain, livestock, textiles. How do you keep an accurate record of all that? The solution was to create a system of symbols, pressed into wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. These were the first cuneiform signs, the earliest form of writing. Think of it less as a sophisticated language, and more like a detailed receipt or a spreadsheet. The earliest writings are lists of beer rations, inventories of grain, and records of transactions. It was a practical invention for a practical problem, and it changed the course of history forever. But the story of ancient Mesopotamia is not a static one. It's a dynamic tapestry of rise and fall, of innovation and conflict. The Sumerian city-states, though sharing a common culture and language, were fiercely independent. They were often at war with one another, vying for control of land, water, and trade routes. These conflicts spurred the development of new technologies, including organized armies and new forms of weaponry. The struggle for dominance was a constant theme, and it shaped the political landscape for centuries. The cities themselves were incredible feats of engineering and organization. The ziggurats, those massive terraced temple towers, were the most prominent feature of the urban landscape. They were not just a symbol of the city's piety, but also a testament to the power of its rulers and priests. Building a ziggurat required immense resources and a large coordinated workforce. It was a statement of strength and devotion, reaching for the heavens while grounding the community firmly to the earth. Imagine walking through the streets of Uruk. The air is thick with the smell of baking bread and the smoke from cooking fires. The sounds are a cacophony of human activity, the clamor of the marketplace, the chatter of people bartering for goods, the rhythmic tapping of a stonemason. The streets are narrow and winding, with high walls of sun-dried brick on either side. Every so often, the wall breaks to reveal a courtyard, where a family goes about its daily life. In the distance, the great ziggurat rises, a towering presence that dominates the skyline, a constant reminder of the gods and the power they bestow upon the city's rulers. Life in these early cities was a complex affair. The social hierarchy was strict and well defined. At the top were the priests and the rulers who held both religious and political power. Below them were the scribes, the engineers, the artisans, and the merchants. At the bottom of the social ladder were the farmers and laborers who worked the fields and built the monumental structures. And below them were the slaves, often prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt. It was a system that, while seemingly rigid, allowed for a level of specialization and complexity that was unprecedented in human history. This period, from the Ubaid culture to the rise of the Sumerian city-states, is a story of slow but steady progress, a story of human ingenuity in the face of environmental challenges. It's the story of how people, by working together and harnessing the power of the rivers, created something entirely new, the first great civilization. It's a story that laid the foundation for everything that would come after, the empires, the laws, the myths, and the technologies. We've only just scratched the surface of this incredible journey, and as we continue, we'll see how this fertile land between the rivers gave rise to powerful kings, legendary heroes, and an enduring legacy that still echoes in our world today. The story begins with the slow, almost imperceptible shift from wandering to settling, from hunting to farming. It's a story of a quiet revolution, one that wasn't fought with swords or spears, but with hoes and irrigation canals. It's a testament to the power of human cooperation and the ability to adapt to a challenging environment. And it is this foundation, this first layer of mud, brick, and clay, upon which the entire incredible history of Mesopotamia is built. The first great kings, the first written laws, the first epics, all of these things were only possible because of the hard work and ingenuity of those early farmers and builders who saw the potential in a land that was both harsh and bountiful. It's a story of beginnings, of the first steps on a path that would lead humanity to the stars, but which began right here, in the sun-drenched plains of Mesopotamia. As the first great cities of Sumer flourished, a new force began to emerge from the fertile mud and organized chaos of urban life: the concept of kingship. This wasn't the kind of kingship we might imagine from a fairy tale, with a crown and a castle, but something far more raw and practical. In the beginning, the leaders of the Sumerian city-states were often NC, or Lugal, terms that can be loosely translated as city governor or king. Their power was not absolute in the way a later pharaohs would be. Rather, it was tied to their role as the chief administrator of the city temple complex, and crucially, as a military leader. The constant warfare between the city-states meant that a good leader was not just a wise priest, but also a fierce warrior, someone who could protect the city's resources and its people. The rise of these Lugals marked a significant shift from a society led by priests to one led by military strongmen. Picture the city of Ur, a rival to Uruk's early dominance. Its king, Mesopotamia, was a figure of immense power, his name immortalized on clay tablets and in the royal tombs that were later discovered. These tombs, a stunning archaeological find, were a window into the opulence and brutality of this early era. They were not just burial chambers, but vast subterranean mausoleums where kings were interred with their retinue, soldiers, servants, and even musicians, all of whom were ritually sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. This grim practice, though shocking to our modern sensibilities, speaks volumes about the absolute power and divine status that these early kings were starting to command. The sheer scale of the burials, with their gold helmets, lapis lazuli jewelry, and intricate lyres, demonstrates a level of wealth and artistic sophistication that was unparalleled at the time. But it wasn't just warfare and ritual that defined this new age. This was also an era of immense intellectual and cultural ferment. With the invention of writing, a class of scribes emerged, men who held a unique and powerful position in society. They were the keepers of knowledge, the record keepers for the temples and palaces, and the administrators who made the complex machinery of the city-state run smoothly. A scribe's education was long and rigorous, involving mastering hundreds of cuneiform signs. It was a path to prestige and power, a way to move up the social ladder in a world where your future was often determined by the family you were born into. Scribes were the first civil servants, the first accountants, and the first historians. They documented everything, from the minutiae of daily transactions to the heroic deeds of their kings. This is where we get the first stories of Mesopotamia, tales of legendary figures that blur the line between myth and history. Perhaps the most famous is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story so powerful and ancient that its echoes still resonate today. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, a figure described as 2/3 god and 1/3 man. The epic doesn't portray him as a purely benevolent ruler. Rather, he's a tyrannical king at the start, oppressing his people with his boundless energy and ambition. His story is one of transformation. The gods, hearing the pleas of the people of Uruk, create a wild man named Enkidu to challenge him. The two fight, and in a twist of fate, their great struggle ends not in death, but in friendship. They become inseparable, embarking on a series of adventures together, battling monsters and defying the gods. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than just a grand adventure story. It is a profound meditation on life, death, and what it means to be human. It explores themes that are timeless: the search for immortality, the nature of friendship, and the acceptance of our own mortality. Gilgamesh, after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, is consumed by a fear of death and sets out on a quest to find the secret to eternal life. He journeys to the ends of the earth, facing impossible challenges, only to ultimately learn a humbling lesson: that immortality is not for mortals. True legacy, the epic teaches, is found not in living forever, but in the great deeds and lasting works you leave behind. The story concludes with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, a changed man, no longer a tyrant but a wise king, who embraces his role as the builder and protector of his city, his monument, and his immortality. The power of these myths cannot be overstated. They were not just entertainment. They were a central part of the cultural fabric, a way for people to understand their world, their place in it, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. The gods of Mesopotamia were numerous and powerful, each city-state having its own patron deity. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, was worshipped in Uruk. Enlil, the god of wind and air, was supreme in Nippur. These gods were not distant or abstract figures. They were active participants in human affairs, often capricious and demanding, requiring constant appeasement through offerings and ritual. The ziggurats, those massive temple towers we mentioned earlier, were thought to be the gods' earthly homes, a place where the divine and human realms could meet. As the Sumerian city-states continued their struggle for supremacy, a new power began to rise to the north. This was the land of Akkad, a region inhabited by a Semitic-speaking people. For a long time, the Akkadians and the Sumerians coexisted, sharing cultural and technological knowledge, but maintaining separate political identities. Then a man named Sargon came to power. His story is the stuff of legend. According to later myths, he was a man of humble beginnings, found in a basket on a river and raised by a gardener. This origin story, similar to that of Moses or Romulus and Remus, was likely propaganda designed to legitimize his rule. But what is certain is that Sargon was a brilliant and ambitious military leader. He first became the king of the city of Kish, and from there he began a campaign of conquest that would forever change the political map of Mesopotamia. Sargon's military campaigns were swift and decisive. He systematically conquered the Sumerian city-states one by one, bringing them under his control. For the first time, the entire region of Mesopotamia was united under a single ruler, creating the world's first true empire. Sargon's empire, known as the Akkadian Empire, was a new kind of political entity. Unlike the loosely confederated city-states, it was a centralized state with a standing army, a bureaucracy, and a royal family that governed the vast territory. Sargon's reign saw a new emphasis on the Akkadian language, which began to supplant Sumerian as the dominant tongue, though both languages would be used for centuries. He established a new capital city, Akkad, the location of which has never been definitively found. The Akkadian Empire was a time of unprecedented growth and stability. Trade flourished, stretching from the Persian Gulf all the way to Anatolia and the Mediterranean. The arts and sciences thrived, and the Akkadian kings, including Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, began to see themselves not just as earthly rulers but as divine figures. Naram-Sin, for example, took the title King of the Four Quarters, a declaration of universal dominion, and had himself depicted with a horned helmet, a symbol previously reserved for the gods. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin shows him as a larger-than-life figure, trampling his enemies underfoot and ascending a mountain, a clear parallel to a deity. This deification of the king was a new development, a further centralization of power, and a new way of asserting authority over a diverse and sprawling empire. But no empire lasts forever, and the Akkadian Empire was no exception. Its decline was a slow process, brought on by a combination of internal rebellions, economic strain, and environmental changes. The constant demands of a centralized government and the high taxes needed to support a large standing army likely fueled unrest. The empire was also vulnerable to attacks from outside forces, particularly nomadic groups from the surrounding mountains. The ultimate blow, according to some historians, may have been a prolonged drought that caused widespread crop failure and famine. Whatever the exact cause, the great Akkadian Empire eventually collapsed, and Mesopotamia once again fractured into a collection of independent city-states, a new cycle of rivalry and conflict beginning again. This period of instability, known as the Dark Age of Mesopotamia, saw the rise of a new power, the Sumerian city-state of Ur. The kings of Ur, a dynasty known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-Thred, would bring about a Sumerian renaissance. They would rebuild the great ziggurat of Ur and establish a new kind of empire, one that was perhaps less about military conquest and more about bureaucratic control. The kings of Ur III were meticulous administrators, and their vast archives of clay tablets show an incredible level of detail about the economy and administration of their state, from the number of livestock in a herd to the grain rations for laborers. They even developed a unified legal code which, while not as famous as Hammurabi's later laws, was a significant step toward a standardized system of justice. This renewed period of stability and prosperity was a brief but brilliant flash of Sumerian power before the final collapse of their civilization. The decline of Ur-Thred was brought on by a combination of internal decay and external pressure, leading to its eventual fall and paving the way for the rise of a new power, the Amorites, a Semitic people from the west. The story of early Mesopotamia, from the first villages to the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, is a constant rhythm of building and destruction, of chaos and order. It is a testament to the resilience of human civilization, its ability to rise from the ashes of one era and build something new and different in the next. The legacy of the Sumerians and Akkadians, their inventions, their myths, their laws, and their great works of art and architecture did not disappear. It was absorbed and carried forward by the people who came after them, the next chapter in the long and winding history of the land between the rivers. The fall of the Ur-III Empire left a power vacuum in Mesopotamia, a familiar pattern in this land of empires. This time, however, the void was filled not by a resurgent Sumerian state, but by a new force, The Amorites. The Amorites were a Semitic-speaking people who had been migrating into Mesopotamia from the western deserts for centuries. Initially, they were seen as a nomadic pastoralist group, but over time they became integrated into Mesopotamian society. As the central authority of Ur III weakened, various Amorite chieftains and dynasties established their own kingdoms in different city-states. This era, often called the Isin-Lhasa period after the two dominant city-states, was a time of political fragmentation and intense rivalry. It was a chaotic and dynamic time, a sort of Mesopotamian Game of Thrones, with city-states constantly forming and breaking alliances, fighting over land, water rights, and trade routes. Amidst this political turmoil, a small, relatively insignificant city in the north, on the banks of the Euphrates, began to gain prominence. Its name was Babylon. For a long time, Babylon was just one of many small kingdoms vying for control, but its fortunes changed dramatically with the rise of a new king, a man whose name would become synonymous with the entire civilization, Hammurabi. When Hammurabi came to power around 1792 BCE, he inherited a small kingdom surrounded by powerful rivals. He was, at first, a shrewd diplomat and an expert military strategist. He spent the first part of his reign consolidating his power and forging alliances, but his true genius lay in his ability to seize an opportunity. Over the next few decades, he systematically defeated his rivals. First Isin and Lhasa, then Mari, and finally the powerful kingdom of Assyria to the north. By the end of his reign, he had unified nearly all of Mesopotamia under his rule, creating what is now known as the Old Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi was more than just a conqueror. He was a master administrator and a visionary lawgiver. He understood that an empire, especially one as vast and diverse as his, could not be held together by military might alone. It needed a common set of rules, a unified legal system that would apply to all his subjects, regardless of their city or social status. This idea, radical for its time, led to his most enduring legacy, the Code of Hammurabi. This was not a secret set of rules known only to the king and his judges. It was a public document, carved on a massive stone stele and placed in the central temple of Babylon for all to see. The stele, which stands over 7 feet tall, is a remarkable work of art and a revolutionary legal document. At the top, a carving depicts Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, a clear statement that his laws were divinely sanctioned and therefore unchangeable. The code itself is a fascinating glimpse into life in ancient Mesopotamia. It is not an abstract philosophical treatise on justice, but a practical, case-based list of laws covering every aspect of society. It deals with property rights, marriage and family law, contracts, and punishments for crimes. The most famous principle of the code is the concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or lex talionis. This principle was not applied universally, however. The punishment often depended on the social status of both the offender and the victim. For example, if a man struck a man of higher status, he would be flogged in public. But if he struck a man of his own status, he would only have to pay a fine. This shows that the code, while a step toward unified justice, was still deeply ingrained in the social hierarchy of the time. The code also provided protection for the vulnerable, including women and children, and set minimum wages for laborers. It was a comprehensive and groundbreaking legal system that would influence legal traditions for centuries. But Hammurabi's influence went far beyond his legal code. Under his rule, Babylon became the cultural and intellectual heart of Mesopotamia. The city itself was transformed. It was a hub of trade and learning, attracting scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the empire. The patron god of Babylon, Marduk, who had previously been a minor deity, was elevated to the position of supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon. This was a clever political move by Hammurabi, who was essentially unifying the religious beliefs of the empire just as he had unified its political structure. The priests of Marduk developed a new theology, creating myths that explained Marduk's rise to power and his creation of the world. This new religious narrative helped legitimize Hammurabi's rule and create a shared cultural identity for his diverse subjects. The Old Babylonian period also saw a flowering of science and literature. Babylonian scribes were meticulous observers of the heavens. They recorded the movements of the planets, the stars, and the moon with astonishing accuracy, creating detailed astronomical tables that were used to predict celestial events and track the passage of time. They developed a sophisticated system of mathematics based on a sexagesimal, base 60 system, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our minutes into 60 seconds. They also made significant advancements in geometry, with clay tablets containing complex calculations that were far ahead of their time. Literature also flourished. The great myths of Sumer and Akkad were collected, edited, and preserved, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written down in its most complete form during this period. The scribes of Babylon were not just copying old texts. They were creating a new intellectual tradition, building upon the knowledge of their ancestors and adding their own innovations. However, the Babylonian Empire, like its predecessors, was not to last. After Hammurabi's death, his successors struggled to maintain control over the vast territory he had conquered. Rebellions became more frequent, and the empire began to shrink. The final blow came around 1595 BCE, when a Hittite king from Anatolia named Mursili I led a daring raid on Babylon. The Hittites were a powerful Indo-European people who had been expanding their own empire to the north. They sacked Babylon, carrying off the statue of Marduk, a great humiliation, and a symbolic end to the Old Babylonian period. The Hittites did not stay to rule, but their raid left the city vulnerable, and it was soon taken over by a new people from the east, the Kassites. The Kassite period, which lasted for several centuries, is sometimes referred to as a dark age by some historians, because the records from this time are not as numerous. However, it was a time of relative stability and cultural continuity. The Kassites were not native Mesopotamians, but they quickly adopted Babylonian culture, language, and religion. They ruled Babylon from afar, often maintaining peace and stability for long periods. They were content to be the kings of Babylon, but their rule lacked the dynamic energy and innovative spirit of Hammurabi's reign. It was a time of consolidation rather than expansion. The Kassite dynasty eventually fell to a resurgent Elamite power from the east, and once again Mesopotamia was in a state of political flux. The cycle of rise and fall, of fragmentation and reunification, was the defining rhythm of Mesopotamian history. The Old Babylonian period, despite its relatively short duration, left a permanent mark. Hammurabi's legal code established a new standard for justice. His empire unified a diverse region, and his capital, Babylon, became a legendary city of learning and culture. Though the empire fell, the ideas and institutions it created did not. They were passed on to the new powers that would emerge in the north and the south, setting the stage for the next great chapter in the story of Mesopotamia. After the decline of the Old Babylonian Empire and the subsequent rule of the Kassites, a new and formidable power began to rise in the north of Mesopotamia, along the upper reaches of the Tigris River. This was Assyria. Unlike the Sumerians and Babylonians, who were more focused on trade, law, and culture, the Assyrians were first and foremost a military society. Their landscape, a rugged terrain of hills and plains, was less naturally fertile than the south, and they were constantly under threat from neighboring peoples. This environment forged a people who were disciplined, pragmatic, and ruthless in war. The Assyrians saw military expansion not just as a means to gain wealth or territory, but as a sacred duty, a way to serve their chief deity, Ashur, the god of their capital city. The history of Assyria is generally divided into three major periods: the Old, Middle, and Neo-Assyrian empires. The first two were periods of expansion and consolidation, where they developed their military machine and political structures. But it was in the Neo-Assyrian period, beginning around the 10th century BCE, that Assyria truly became a world-conquering force, an empire on a scale Mesopotamia had never seen before. Their expansion was driven by a new kind of military strategy and an ideology of relentless conquest. The Assyrian army was a professional fighting force, a highly organized and disciplined machine unlike anything that had come before. They were innovators in siege warfare, developing tools like the battering ram and mobile siege towers to breach the walls of heavily fortified cities. They were pioneers in psychological warfare, using terror as a weapon to demoralize their enemies before a single battle was fought. They would publicize their brutal tactics, impaling captured enemy leaders on stakes, flaying prisoners, and deporting entire populations to spread fear and discourage rebellion. It was a strategy of shock and awe, meant to crush resistance before it could even begin. One of the most famous and feared Assyrian kings was Tiglath-Pileser III. He came to the throne in the 8th century BCE and completely reformed the Assyrian military and government. He was the architect of the Neo-Assyrian Empire's expansion, introducing new tactics and administrative systems. He created a standing army of professional soldiers, a mobile and highly efficient fighting force that could be deployed anywhere in the empire at a moment's notice. He also perfected the practice of mass deportation, not just as a form of punishment, but as a tool of social engineering. He would forcibly move conquered populations to different parts of the empire, scattering them and breaking up their cultural and political ties. This made it much harder for them to organize rebellions. For example, the biblical account of the 10 lost tribes of Israel refers to the deportation of the Israelite population by the Assyrians. These deportations, while brutal, were also a way to populate new territories and provide a workforce for massive public works projects. Under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, the Assyrian Empire expanded to an incredible size, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Egypt, Turkey, and Iran. The Assyrians built magnificent new capital cities to reflect their power and dominance. Ashur and Nimrud were impressive, but the city that truly symbolized the height of Assyrian power was Nineveh. Built by King Sennacherib, it was a city of monumental proportions, with massive walls, a complex system of canals and aqueducts, and a vast palace known as the Palace Without Rival. It was in this palace that archaeologists discovered a great library, a treasure trove of cuneiform tablets collected by King Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was the last great king of Assyria, and while he was a fearsome warrior, he was also a man of letters. He was, by all accounts, a patron of culture and a passionate collector of knowledge. His library at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of clay tablets, covering every aspect of Mesopotamian life: history, law, medicine, astronomy, and literature. It was a deliberate effort to preserve the sum total of human knowledge up to that point. The great epics and myths of the Sumerians and Babylonians, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, were carefully copied and preserved in this library. This is why we know so much about ancient Mesopotamian civilization today. Had Ashurbanipal not collected these texts, much of that history would have been lost forever. However, the very brutality that had built the Assyrian Empire also sowed the seeds of its destruction. Their relentless military campaigns and harsh treatment of conquered peoples created a legacy of hatred. The empire was simply too large and too centralized for one king to control effectively, and constant rebellions drained its resources. The end came swiftly and dramatically. A coalition of rebellious states, led by the Babylonians and the Medes from the east, rose up against Assyrian rule. In 612 BCE, they laid siege to and sacked Nineveh, the great city that had once seemed invincible. The fall of Nineveh was so complete that for centuries its location was lost to memory. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Middle East for over 3 centuries, simply vanished, leaving behind its magnificent palaces and a reputation for unparalleled ferocity. But its legacy was not one of destruction alone. The Assyrians were masters of administration and engineering. They built the world's first extensive network of roads, which, while meant to facilitate military movement, also encouraged trade and communication. They developed a sophisticated system of provincial government to rule their vast empire. They also left behind a breathtaking collection of art, particularly the stone relief carvings that decorated their palaces. These carvings, which depict scenes of battle, hunting, and royal life, are not just beautiful. They are a vital historical record, providing a visual narrative of their conquests and beliefs. The Assyrian Empire was the first true superpower in world history, and its rise and fall are a powerful lesson in the nature of power, expansion, and the fragile balance between conquest and stability. The fall of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BCE was a momentous event, not just for Mesopotamia, but for the entire ancient world. Its collapse left a massive power vacuum, and from the ashes of Nineveh, a new empire rose, one that would make Babylon, once a minor kingdom under Hammurabi, the undisputed center of the world once again. This was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and its short but brilliant history is a story of a cultural revival and a final spectacular swan song for Mesopotamian civilization. The founder of this new empire was a man named Nabopolassar. A Chaldean from the south of Mesopotamia, he had served as an Assyrian general before rebelling against them. He formed a crucial alliance with the Medes, a powerful Indo-Iranian people from modern-day Iran, who had also suffered under Assyrian rule. Together they launched a series of campaigns that culminated in the siege and destruction of Nineveh. Nabopolassar's victory was not just a military triumph, it was the beginning of a new era. He established Babylon as his capital and began the process of rebuilding and restoring the city to its former glory. But the real architect of the Neo-Babylonian Golden Age was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. His name is one of the most famous in ancient history, largely because of his prominent role in the Bible, where he is portrayed as the king who conquered Judah and destroyed Jerusalem. But he was far more than just a biblical villain. Nebuchadnezzar II was a brilliant military strategist, an ambitious builder, and a shrewd ruler. He spent his long reign, from 605 to 562 BCE, not only expanding the empire's borders, but also turning Babylon into a city of unparalleled splendor. Imagine stepping through the Ishtar Gate, the main entrance to the city, which still exists today in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The gate is a massive, arching structure made of blue glazed bricks, adorned with reliefs of dragons and bulls, sacred animals of the gods. This was the grand entrance to a city that was a wonder of the ancient world. Inside, a wide processional way led to the great ziggurat, a 7-tiered temple tower dedicated to the god Marduk. This ziggurat, which the Babylonians called Etemenanki, was the supposed inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. It was an awe-inspiring structure, a symbolic staircase connecting the earth to the heavens. Beside it stood the Temple of Marduk, the central religious site of the empire. But perhaps the most legendary of Nebuchadnezzar's projects was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The ancient Greeks and Romans considered it one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though its existence is still debated by archaeologists, it is described by ancient writers as a series of terraced gardens, rising in tiers to a great height, with water being pumped to the top to irrigate the plants and trees. The gardens, if they existed, would have been a technological marvel, a triumph of engineering and a testament to the king's power and wealth. Whether a physical reality or a legendary embellishment, the Hanging Gardens symbolize the magnificence and ambition of the Neo-Babylonian era. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was not only a center of architectural splendor, but also a hub of scientific and intellectual activity. The Babylonians were at the peak of their astronomical knowledge. The meticulous records kept by their scribes over centuries allowed them to make remarkably accurate predictions of celestial phenomena, including eclipses. They divided the sky into constellations and mapped the paths of the planets. Their astrological beliefs, which linked the movements of the stars to human destiny, were deeply influential and would be passed down to the Greeks and Romans. The Babylonians also made significant contributions to mathematics, particularly in the fields of algebra and geometry. They developed a sophisticated system for solving quadratic equations and calculating the area of complex shapes, using a base 60 system that still influences our modern world. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was also a multicultural society. The deportations practiced by the Assyrians meant that Babylon was now home to a diverse population, including people from Syria, Phoenicia, and Judah. The king's policy was to use these populations for his massive building projects, and to integrate them into the empire's economy. This integration, however, was not always smooth. The Jewish population, for example, lived in exile, mourning their lost homeland and longing for a return to Jerusalem, as documented in the biblical book of Psalms. Their time in Babylon, however, was also a period of immense intellectual and religious development, as they began to write down their history and religious laws, a process that would eventually lead to the formation of the Hebrew Bible. Despite its grandeur, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was relatively short-lived. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, a series of weak and short-lived rulers followed. The empire, though seemingly powerful, was facing a new and formidable threat from the east, the Persians. The Persians, under their dynamic and charismatic leader Cyrus the Great, were building an empire of a different kind. Cyrus was known for his policy of religious and cultural tolerance. Instead of deporting conquered populations, he often allowed them to return to their homes and worship their own gods. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched on Babylon. The city, with its massive walls, seemed impregnable, but according to ancient accounts, Cyrus's army diverted the waters of the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city and entered through the riverbed. The city fell without a fight. The last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, was a controversial figure who had spent much of his reign in an oasis in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his stead. The Babylonian priests and people, who were disgruntled with Nabonidus's neglect of the traditional gods, may have even welcomed Cyrus's arrival. Cyrus, true to his policy, allowed the exiled Jewish population to return to Jerusalem and even helped fund the rebuilding of their temple. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great marks a pivotal moment. It was not a destructive conquest like the fall of Nineveh. Instead, it was a transition of power. The Persian Empire, which would go on to be the largest the world had yet seen, absorbed the Babylonian civilization, preserving its intellectual traditions and administrative systems. The age of native Mesopotamian empires was over. For the next several centuries, Mesopotamia would be ruled by foreign powers, first the Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and later the Romans and Parthians. But the legacy of Mesopotamia did not disappear. It was a civilization built on layers, with each new conqueror absorbing and building upon the achievements of the last. The Persians adopted the Babylonian cuneiform script for their official royal inscriptions, and they used Babylonian astronomical knowledge to develop their own calendar. When Alexander the Great conquered the region, He too was in awe of Babylon, and he had planned to make it the capital of his new empire before his untimely death. The Greeks were particularly fascinated by Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, which they incorporated into their own scientific traditions. In the end, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, did not die. It simply transformed. Its inventions, writing, the wheel, the plow, the legal code, and the division of time, are still with us today. Its myths and stories are woven into the fabric of our own religious and cultural narratives. The history of this ancient land is a testament to the enduring power of human innovation, the cyclical nature of empires, and the profound, long-lasting impact of a civilization that laid the groundwork for the modern world. The rise of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great marked the end of an era for Mesopotamia. The land between the rivers, which had been the heartland of human civilization for over 3 millennia, was now a province in a much larger, more diverse empire. This was a monumental shift. For the first time in its long history, Mesopotamia was not ruled by a native dynasty. It was the subject of a foreign king, a distant ruler whose capital was not in Babylon or Ur, but in places like Persepolis and Pasargadae, far to the east in modern-day Iran. But this was not an era of decline for Mesopotamia, at least not at first. Instead, it was a time of integration and cultural synthesis, where the ancient traditions of Babylon and Assyria were absorbed into the vast and efficient machinery of the Persian state. Cyrus the Great, as we've already touched upon, was a different kind of conqueror. His policies were revolutionary for their time. He did not seek to destroy the cultures he conquered, but rather to govern them through a policy of tolerance and respect. He famously allowed the exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. He honored the gods of his new subjects and presented himself as a legitimate successor to the Babylonian kings. The Persians were shrewd administrators. They divided their vast empire into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a satrap or governor, who was often a native of the region. This system of indirect rule allowed for a degree of autonomy and cultural continuity. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia was a vital part of the empire. Babylon, though no longer a capital in the same way, remained a major city of commerce and learning. The city's ancient canals and irrigation systems were maintained, and its scribes continued their meticulous work, especially in the fields of astronomy and mathematics. Persian kings like Darius the Great used Babylonian scholars for their expertise. The famous Behistun inscription, a massive relief carving on a cliffside, was written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This multilingual inscription was the key that later allowed scholars to decipher cuneiform. It was the Mesopotamian script that provided the Rosetta Stone for understanding this lost language, a final ironic testament to its enduring importance. But the story of Mesopotamia in this era is not just about its relationship with its new Persian rulers. It is also the story of the slow but steady decline of its unique cultural identity. As the centuries passed, the old cuneiform script, with its thousands of symbols, became less and less common. It was a complex system that required years of training to master. The simpler alphabetic scripts used by the Phoenicians and later the Aramaic language, which was the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, began to take its place. Aramaic was an easy language to learn. Its simple alphabet made literacy more accessible, and it was used for trade and communication across the entire empire. As Aramaic became the language of everyday life, the ancient traditions, myths, and sciences that were written in Akkadian and Sumerian began to fade from memory. The knowledge of reading and writing cuneiform became a specialized skill, confined to a small class of scholars and priests in the great temples of Babylon and Uruk. And then, a new force emerged from the West, a power that would reshape the world and bring about the final act of this ancient drama. This was the Macedonian Empire, led by the brilliant and ambitious young king, Alexander the Great. Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE was swift and decisive. His army, a highly trained and disciplined force of Greek and Macedonian soldiers, swept through the Middle East, winning a series of stunning victories against the Persian army. When he arrived in Babylon, he was not seen as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The city's priests and people welcomed him, offering him the keys to the city. Alexander, in turn, showed respect for their traditions. He ordered the rebuilding of the great ziggurat of Marduk, Etemenanki, which had fallen into disrepair under the Persians. He even had plans to make Babylon the capital of his new vast empire, a city that would be the meeting point of East and West. However, Alexander's sudden death in Babylon in 323 BCE shattered his dreams. His massive empire was immediately plunged into a succession crisis and was eventually divided among his generals. The general who took control of Mesopotamia and the surrounding territories was named Seleucus. This began the Hellenistic period, a new era in which Greek culture, language, and ideas spread throughout the former Persian Empire. The Seleucid Empire, with its capital first in Seleucia on the Tigris, and later in Antioch in Syria, was a fusion of Greek and Mesopotamian traditions. Greek colonists and merchants settled in the new cities, bringing with them their own customs, their own language, and their own architecture. For a time, the old Mesopotamian traditions continued. The great temples of Babylon and Uruk remained centers of learning. The scribes still produced astronomical tablets in cuneiform, meticulously documenting the movements of the planets. The latest known cuneiform tablet is an astronomical text from 75 CE, an incredible testament to the long life of this writing system, which was in use for over 3 millennia. But by this point, the old ways were a relic. The great ziggurats and temples were crumbling, and the old gods were being forgotten. The cities of Sumer and Akkad, which had once been bustling metropolises, were now abandoned and buried under the sands of time. The people had moved to new cities, new centers of commerce, and adopted new languages and religions. The final blow to the old Mesopotamian identity was not a single event, but a slow, gradual process of cultural assimilation and decline. The region was a battleground for new empires, first the Seleucids, then the Parthians, and finally the Romans. Each new wave of conquerors and settlers brought with them their own traditions, and the ancient legacy of Sumer and Babylon slowly faded into memory. The great works of literature, science, and history were no longer copied. The once mighty ziggurats, which had reached for the heavens, became little more than mud-brick hills in the desert landscape. The knowledge of how to read the ancient cuneiform script was lost completely, and for over 1,000 years, the story of Mesopotamia was a mystery, a blank page in the book of history. It would not be until the 19th century that this lost world would be rediscovered. European explorers and scholars, fueled by a spirit of adventure and a fascination with the ancient world, began to excavate the great mounds of Mesopotamia. At first they were just searching for biblical sites, for proof of the stories of the Old Testament. But as they dug, they began to uncover the ruins of ancient cities, the walls of Babylon, the royal palaces of Assyria, and the buried ziggurats of Ur and Uruk. And then, a breakthrough. The discovery of the Behistun inscription, which we mentioned earlier, and the tireless work of scholars like Henry Rawlinson, who finally cracked the code of cuneiform, allowed the ancient voices to speak again. The dusty clay tablets, which had been silent for over 2,000 years, began to tell their stories, stories of kings and gods, of law and science, of love and death. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia was a monumental event. It completely changed our understanding of human history. We had always thought that our civilization began with the Greeks and Romans. But suddenly a much older and more profound story was uncovered. It was a story of a civilization that invented writing, the city, the legal code, and so much more. It was a story that showed us that our modern world is built on a foundation that is far, far older than we ever imagined. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not just in the objects we find in museums. It is in the very structure of our society, in the way we divide our time, in the laws that govern our lives, and in the stories we tell. The final chapter in the history of ancient Mesopotamia is not its conquest by the Persians or its decline under the Seleucids. It is its rediscovery in the modern era, the moment when we were finally able to hear the whispers of a forgotten world. It is a story that reminds us that even when a civilization disappears from the surface of the earth, its legacy can endure, buried beneath the dust and waiting to be found. The great ziggurat of Ur, once the heart of a vibrant city, now stands as a quiet monument to a forgotten people. But their story, once lost, now lives on, told by the words they themselves carved in clay, a final and enduring gift to the world they helped create. As the sun sets on the age of ancient Mesopotamian empires, and the final chapter of their political dominance is written, it's easy to think of this as a story with a neat ending. But in reality, the influence of this civilization did not disappear. It was a river that flowed underground for centuries only to resurface in unexpected places, shaping the world in profound ways that we often take for granted. This final part of our journey is not about kings and conquests, but about ideas, about the enduring legacy of a people who lived in a land between two rivers. The first and most fundamental gift of Mesopotamia to the world was writing. Think about what that invention truly meant. Before cuneiform, human knowledge was fragile. It was passed down from generation to person, in stories, in songs, and in rituals. It was subject to the whims of memory, to misinterpretation, and to the inevitable forgetting that comes with the passage of time. But with writing, knowledge became tangible. It was stored on clay tablets, a physical record that could be read, copied, and studied by future generations. It was the invention that made all other inventions possible. Laws could be codified, like the Code of Hammurabi. Histories could be recorded, like the annals of the Assyrian kings. Scientific observations could be documented, like the astronomical tables of the Babylonians. The very idea of history itself, as we understand it, begins with the written word. It was a revolution on par with the invention of the printing press or the internet. And from this invention came the birth of literature. The stories of Gilgamesh, the myths of Ishtar and Marduk, the flood narrative that echoes in so many later traditions. These were not just tales told around a fire. They were masterpieces of epic poetry and prose, explorations of universal human themes. The Epic of Gilgamesh in particular is a stunning work that grapples with mortality, friendship, and the quest for meaning. Its themes are so timeless that it continues to be studied and admired today. It is a powerful reminder that the first great civilization not only built cities but also created a rich and complex inner world, one filled with heroes, gods, and philosophical questions. But the Mesopotamian legacy is far more than just writing and literature. It is also the foundation of much of our science and mathematics. The Babylonians in particular were brilliant astronomers and mathematicians. They were driven by a need to understand the world around them, to predict the future, and to organize their society. Their contributions were immense. The concept of a sexagesimal system based on the number 60 is a perfect example. Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute? Why do we measure a circle with 360 degrees? The answer is because the Babylonians thought it was a useful way to measure time and space. The number 60 is easily divisible by many other numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, which made it an ideal system for complex calculations. It's a system that has been so useful that it has survived for thousands of years, long after the civilization that invented it was gone. Their astronomical observations were equally groundbreaking. They kept meticulous records of the movements of the planets, the stars, and the moon, not for scientific curiosity alone, but for religious and astrological reasons. They believed that the celestial bodies were a map of the gods' will, a way to divine the future. While we no longer share their beliefs, their data was so accurate that later Greek and Roman astronomers relied on it for centuries. The names of many of our constellations, the signs of the zodiac, and the very idea of a horoscope can be traced directly back to the Mesopotamians. They were the first to systematically study the cosmos, to see the universe not as a chaotic mystery, but as a predictable, ordered system that could be understood. Beyond science, the Mesopotamians also pioneered the concepts of law and justice. Before Hammurabi, laws were often arbitrary, and justice was dispensed on a whim by local leaders. The Code of Hammurabi, with its 282 laws, was a revolutionary document because it established the principle of a standardized, written legal code. It was an attempt to create a more equitable and predictable society where the rules were known to everyone. It wasn't perfect, as we've discussed, with its different punishments for different social classes, but it was a monumental step forward. The idea that a government has a duty to provide a legal framework for its citizens, that justice should be based on a fixed set of rules rather than the personal bias of a ruler, is a legacy of Mesopotamia that is still at the heart of our modern legal systems. And of course, we can't forget the more practical inventions. The wheel, a simple but world-changing invention that transformed transportation and commerce. The plough, which revolutionized agriculture and allowed for the production of food surpluses that made cities possible. The concept of a city-state itself, a form of government and social organization that laid the groundwork for nations and empires. The invention of beer, which was a staple of the Mesopotamian diet and a central part of their social and religious life. These are not just isolated inventions. They are the building blocks of the modern world. They are the answers to problems that humanity has faced for millennia, and the Mesopotamians were the first to find them. So, as we conclude our story, we are left not with a sense of an ancient civilization that is lost and gone, but with a feeling of continuity. The echoes of Mesopotamia are all around us. They are in the minutes on our clocks, in the constellations in our night sky, in the legal documents we sign, and in the very act of writing these words. The people of the land between the rivers were not so different from us. They grappled with the same questions of life and death. They longed for security. They sought to build a better future for their children, and they dreamed of leaving a legacy that would last forever. In many ways, they succeeded beyond their wildest imagination. Their empire may have crumbled, their language may have died, but their ideas, their spirit of innovation, their quest for knowledge, and their tireless effort to build a better world live on. Rest now, weary traveler. You have walked with kings and warriors, sailed the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, and witnessed the birth of a civilization. The long journey is over, and the ancient whispers have faded into the peaceful silence of the night. Let the lessons of this ancient land settle in your mind like the dust of the desert, and let the long, slow rhythm of time lull you into a deep and tranquil sleep. The story of Mesopotamia is one of creation, of endurance, and of legacy, and now it is a part of your own journey into a quiet and restful peace. After the grand narrative of empires, of rising and falling dynasties, we must now delve deeper into the very fabric of Mesopotamian society itself. This is a journey away from the broad strokes of history and into the details of daily life, to understand the people who lived in this land and the world they created. We'll explore their beliefs, their social structures, their homes, and their everyday struggles and joys. This is where the story truly comes alive, where the abstract idea of a civilization becomes a mosaic of individual lives. Imagine yourself as a resident of ancient Babylon during the reign of Hammurabi, or perhaps as a farmer in a small village outside the great city of Uruk thousands of years earlier. Life was a constant, intimate relationship with the land and the rivers. The two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were not just geographical features. They were the lifeblood of the civilization. Their unpredictable floods, sometimes a blessing of fertile silt, and other times a destructive force of chaos, dictated the rhythm of life. The greatest challenge for these people was not just to survive, but to tame the rivers. This required an immense amount of communal effort. Every year people would work together to clean and expand the intricate network of irrigation canals that crisscrossed the land, guiding the precious water to their fields of barley, wheat, dates, and sesame. This collective labor was a cornerstone of their society, fostering a sense of community and shared purpose. Daily life for most people revolved around agriculture. The farmer, with his simple plow and a team of oxen, was the foundation of the economy. The family unit was the central pillar of society. The father was the head of the household, responsible for the well-being and honor of his family. Marriages were typically arranged, often with a dowry, and were seen as a contract between two families. While women did not have the same rights as men, they were not completely powerless. They could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce under certain circumstances. A mother's role was particularly revered, as she was the one who nurtured the next generation, ensuring the continuity of the family line and the preservation of tradition. But life wasn't all about farming. As society grew more complex, so did the division of labor. Artisans and craftsmen played a vital role. In the narrow, winding streets of a Mesopotamian city, you would find potters hunched over their wheels, shaping the clay from the riverbeds into jars and bowls. You would hear the clang of the coppersmith's hammer, transforming raw metal into tools and weapons. Weavers would sit at their looms, creating textiles from wool, a key export of the region. The Mesopotamians were master craftsmen, and their products, from intricate cylinder seals to beautiful jewelry made of gold and lapis lazuli, were a testament to their skill. These craftsmen were not just anonymous laborers. They often belonged to guilds and enjoyed a degree of social status. Beyond the craftsmen, a small, highly privileged class held the keys to power and knowledge, the scribes. To be a scribe was to be a member of an elite, educated class. The training was long and arduous, starting from childhood. Students, usually boys, would spend years in the eduba, the tablet house or school, where they would learn to read and write the complex cuneiform script. They would practice on clay tablets, copying out lists of words, mathematical problems, and famous stories. The job of a scribe was to be a record keeper, an accountant, and a royal secretary. They wrote contracts, recorded legal decisions, and drafted diplomatic letters. Their literacy and mathematical skills made them indispensable to the temples and the palaces, and they enjoyed a life of comfort and influence, a stark contrast to the hard labor of the farmer. But life was also shaped by the unseen world, the realm of the gods and goddesses. The Mesopotamians were deeply religious, and their entire worldview was centered on the belief that humanity's purpose was to serve the gods. They believed in a vast pantheon of deities, each with their own domain. Ishtar was the goddess of love and war. Enlil was the god of wind and air. The city's patron deity was the most important, and the king was seen as the chosen representative of that god on earth. The relationship between humans and the gods was not always a comfortable one. The gods were powerful and often unpredictable, prone to anger and jealousy. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods could unleash floods, famines, and plagues if they were not properly honored. This fear and respect for the divine led to a constant cycle of rituals, offerings, and prayers. The massive ziggurats we discussed earlier were not just monuments. They were believed to be the homes of the gods, a place where the divine could descend to earth. The people also believed in a world of spirits and demons. To a Mesopotamian, the world was a living, breathing place, filled with both benevolent and malevolent forces. They used magical incantations and amulets to protect themselves from evil spirits and to cure illnesses, which they believed were often caused by demonic possession. Medicine was a blend of natural remedies and magical rituals. The doctor, or asyu, would use herbs and plants, while the exorcist, or ashipu, would use spells and rituals to drive out the evil spirits. This holistic view of the world, where the physical and spiritual were intertwined, was central to their everyday lives. Their beliefs about death were somber. They believed that after death, the soul descended to a dark, dusty underworld, a place known as the land of no return. There, they would exist as shadowy spirits, eating dust and clay. The only way to ensure a measure of comfort in the afterlife was to be properly buried and remembered by your family. The living were responsible for providing offerings of food and drink to the deceased's grave, a practice that ensured the spirit would be at rest and not return to haunt the world of the living. This belief in the importance of a proper burial and remembrance shaped their funeral practices and reinforced the importance of the family unit. In the midst of this complex world of work, religion, and family, there was also a vibrant intellectual life. The Mesopotamians loved to learn and to ponder the great questions of existence. The schools, though reserved for the elite, were centers of learning, where scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and music. They believed that knowledge was a way to understand the divine will and to bring order to a chaotic world. They compiled extensive lists of plants, animals, and minerals, creating the first encyclopedias. They wrote commentaries on ancient texts and developed sophisticated methods of interpretation. Their quest for knowledge was not a detached academic pursuit. It was an integral part of their spiritual and social life. The story of Mesopotamia, then, is not just about the epic rise and fall of empires. It is about the rhythm of a civilization, the daily lives of the people who worked the land, built the cities, and worshipped the gods. It is a story of a culture that, through its resilience and ingenuity, created the very foundations of the world we live in today. It is a testament to the power of human connection, of the shared labor that built canals, and the shared belief that built ziggurats. And as we leave this ancient land, let us remember that the greatest legacy of Mesopotamia is not found in a museum, but in the enduring spirit of human innovation and the timeless search for meaning and order in a world between two rivers. As the gentle whispers of the past continue to guide you, we move from the grand narratives of kings and cities to the quiet, powerful realm of belief and myth. Ancient Mesopotamia was a civilization built not just on mud, brick, and canals, but on a rich, complex tapestry of religious beliefs that permeated every aspect of daily life. To truly understand these people, we must understand their gods, their myths, and their unique way of seeing the world. This is a journey into their souls, into the stories they told themselves to make sense of a world that was both bountiful and terrifying. At the heart of Mesopotamian religion was a vast and intricate pantheon of gods and goddesses. Unlike the single, all-powerful deity of many later religions, the Mesopotamians worshipped a host of divinities, each with their own specific domain and personality. These gods were not seen as distant, abstract beings. They were deeply intertwined with the human world, and their actions, moods, and relationships directly influenced the lives of mortals. The gods were a family, complete with rivalries, love affairs, and acts of immense power and cruelty. The head of the pantheon varied over time and from city to city. In the earliest Sumerian period, the chief gods were An, the god of the heavens, Enlil, the god of the air and storms, and Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. Enlil was a particularly powerful and often fearsome figure. It was Enlil who, in the Great Flood myth, decided to wipe out humanity because their noise was disturbing his rest. This myth, of course, has a striking parallel in the biblical story of Noah, but it was Enki who saved humanity by warning one of his favorites, a man named Utnapishtim, to build an ark. This story shows the capricious nature of the gods, their power to destroy and their willingness to save, but only on a whim. As different city-states rose to prominence, their local gods were elevated to supreme status. When Babylon became the center of the world under Hammurabi, its patron god Marduk was elevated to the head of the pantheon. The priests of Marduk created a new myth, the Enuma Elish, or When on High, to explain his rise to power. This epic tells the story of how Marduk, a young, powerful god, defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat, and then used her body to create the heavens and the earth. He then created humanity from the blood of a slain demon, a clear message that humanity's purpose was to serve the gods and do their bidding. This myth not only legitimized Marduk's supremacy, but also provided a cosmic explanation for the world's creation and humanity's place in it. The Mesopotamians also worshipped a goddess who was immensely popular and powerful, Inanna, known to the Akkadians as Ishtar. She was a goddess of stark contradictions. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, and at the same time the goddess of war, conflict, and destruction. She was a fiery, passionate, and often vengeful deity. Her famous myth, The Descent of Inanna, tells the story of her journey into the underworld to challenge her sister, the goddess of the dead, for power. She is stripped of her clothing and possessions at each of the 7 gates of the underworld until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister. This myth is a powerful exploration of death, sacrifice, and rebirth, and it was a central part of Mesopotamian religious thought. Religious practice was a central part of daily life. The people believed that the gods had to be constantly appeased and cared for, much like a great king or a lord. The ziggurats and temples were not just places of worship, they were the houses of the gods. Priests and priestesses were tasked with caring for the gods' statues, which were believed to be the physical embodiment of the deity. They would feed the statues, dress them in fine clothes, and parade them through the streets on special occasions. This was a physical, tangible relationship with the divine, one that required constant upkeep and ritual. Beyond the great public rituals, there was also a more personal relationship with the divine. Every family had a patron god, or a personal protective deity, a kind of guardian angel. People would carry small statues or amulets of their personal gods for protection. They would offer prayers and small sacrifices at their home altars. Dreams were seen as a way for the gods to communicate with humans, and dream interpreters were highly sought after. Omens were everywhere, in the flight of a bird, in the shape of a cloud, in the liver of a sacrificed animal. The Mesopotamians were constantly looking for signs from the gods, a way to divine their will and understand the future. The Mesopotamians also developed a fascinating and complex system of cosmology. They believed that the world was a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean. Above the earth was the heavens, where the gods resided, and below it was the dark underworld, the final resting place for the dead. The stars and planets were not just celestial bodies. They were the physical manifestations of the gods, and their movements were seen as a divine script that could be read by skilled astronomers. This is why their astronomical observations were so precise. For them, it was not just a scientific pursuit, it was a religious one. By charting the movements of the planets, they were trying to understand the mind of the gods. But what did these myths and beliefs tell us about the Mesopotamian worldview? They tell us that they saw the world as a place of constant struggle, a battle between chaos and order, and that humanity's role was to help maintain that order. They saw their existence as precarious and dependent on the whims of the gods. Their myths were not comforting stories of divine love and grace. They were often brutal and unforgiving, a reflection of the harsh realities of their environment. The capricious rivers, the brutal heat, the constant threat of famine and war, all of these things were reflected in their worldview and their stories. Yet despite this, there was also a profound sense of purpose. They believed that by building cities, by writing laws, by studying the stars, and by honoring the gods, they were participating in a great cosmic project. They were bringing order to a chaotic world. They were creating a legacy that would outlast their own short lives. And in this sense, their religion was not just a source of fear, but also a source of meaning, a way to find purpose in a difficult world. The Mesopotamian myths and beliefs, while seemingly ancient and strange to us, were a powerful and profound attempt to answer the most fundamental questions of human existence. They are a timeless reminder that every civilization, no matter how distant, finds a way to tell its story, to connect with the divine, and to give meaning to the long journey of life. As we continue our journey, we move from the spiritual world of gods and myths to the very tangible and extraordinary realm of Mesopotamian art and architecture. This is where we can see the deep connection between their beliefs and their daily lives, where their worldview was literally built into the fabric of their cities. Their monumental constructions were not just places to live or work. They were a physical expression of their power, their piety, and their unique understanding of the cosmos. The most iconic structures of ancient Mesopotamia were, without a doubt, the ziggurats. We've mentioned them before as the great temple towers that dominated the city skylines, but let's take a closer look at what they were and why they were so important. A ziggurat was a massive stepped pyramid made of mud brick with a temple or shrine at the very top. They were not built as tombs like the Egyptian pyramids, but as a symbolic staircase connecting the earth and the heavens. The word ziggurat itself comes from an Assyrian word that means to build on a raised area. They were a physical manifestation of the Mesopotamian belief that the gods resided on mountaintops. In the flat alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, there were no natural mountains, so they built their own, a sacred space where the divine and human realms could meet. Building a ziggurat was an immense undertaking, a project that required the labor of thousands of people and a profound understanding of engineering. The core of the structure was made of sun-dried mud bricks, which were prone to erosion. To combat this, they used a facing of fired bricks, which were much more durable. The ziggurats often had a complex drainage system to prevent water damage from rain. The immense scale of these structures was a testament to the power and wealth of the city and its ruler, but also to the communal effort and religious devotion of its people. The famous ziggurat of Ur, still partially standing today, is a powerful example of this architectural feat. It was built by King Ur-Nammu in honor of the moon god Nana, and was the heart of the city's religious life. Beyond the ziggurats, Mesopotamian architecture was defined by the widespread use of mud brick. Lacking stone or timber, the people turned to the most abundant resource available, the clay from the riverbeds. They learned to mix the clay with straw, press it into molds, and dry it in the sun to create a simple but effective building material. This humble brick was the foundation of everything, from simple houses to massive palaces and city walls. While sun-dried bricks were not as strong as stone, they were excellent insulators against the intense heat, and the Mesopotamians were masters at using them to create vaulted ceilings and arches. The walls of their cities were also built from mud brick, and they were massive. The walls of Babylon, for example, were said to be so thick that a chariot could turn on top of them. This was a necessary feature in a world of constant warfare, where city walls were the primary defense against enemy armies. But it was not just the grand scale that defined Mesopotamian art. It was also the intricate detail and powerful symbolism. The art was almost always a reflection of their society's values: kingship, religion, and warfare. A common artistic medium was the cylinder seal, a small, carved stone cylinder that was used to roll an impression onto wet clay. These seals were used to mark ownership or to sign a document, much like a signature today. The scenes carved onto them were miniature masterpieces, depicting gods, kings, and mythological creatures. They were a form of personal identification, a work of art, and a powerful symbol of status all in one. One of the most remarkable examples of Mesopotamian art is the royal standard of Ur, a box-like object discovered in the royal tombs of Ur. It is a mosaic made of shells, red limestone, and lapis lazuli. One side, known as the war panel, depicts a king leading his army in a campaign, with his chariots trampling the enemies. The other side, the peace panel, shows a royal banquet, with a king and his court enjoying a feast, while musicians play and servants bring goods. The standard is a vivid and detailed depiction of Mesopotamian society, showing the two central pillars of their existence: the necessity of warfare to ensure survival, and the celebration of the abundance that their society created. It's a snapshot of a world that valued both might and prosperity. The Assyrians in their time took Mesopotamian art in a new direction, while they also used cylinder seals and created monumental architecture. Their signature art form was the stone relief carvings that decorated their royal palaces. These reliefs were a form of visual propaganda. They were not just decorative. They were a way for the kings to tell their story, to immortalize their conquests, their hunts, and their piety. They were incredibly detailed, showing kings slaying lions, triumphant armies marching into battle, and enemies being led away in chains. The famous reliefs from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh are a stunning example. They show a ferocious lion hunt with the king, a powerful figure, single-handedly subduing the beasts. These reliefs were meant to project an image of the king as a powerful, semi-divine figure, a protector of the people, and a master of both the human and animal worlds. The Neo-Babylonian period, under Nebuchadnezzar II, brought about a final, glorious flowering of Mesopotamian art. The most famous example is the Ishtar Gate, the magnificent entrance to the city of Babylon. It was a masterpiece of glazed brick, a technology that was a significant advance over simple mud brick. The gate was decorated with colorful reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons, all symbolic animals associated with the city's gods. The vibrant blue of the bricks, created with a special firing technique, would have made the gate a truly spectacular sight, a monument to the city's wealth and its religious devotion. The art and architecture of Mesopotamia tell us a profound story. They reveal a civilization that was deeply practical, using the materials at hand to build cities and empires. But they also show a people with a rich spiritual life, who believed that the physical world was a reflection of the divine. Their ziggurats were a link to the gods. Their palaces were a stage for their king's power, and their art was a way to communicate their values and beliefs to themselves and to future generations. In their art and architecture, we can see the full range of the human experience in this ancient land: the struggle for survival, the quest for power, the deep respect for the divine, and the timeless desire to create something beautiful and lasting. As you drift deeper into tranquility, let's turn our attention from the world of humans and gods to a more subtle but equally powerful force that shaped ancient Mesopotamia: technology and innovation. The people of this ancient land were not just builders of empires and temples. They were brilliant inventors and problem solvers. Many of the tools, systems, and ideas we take for granted today have their roots in the rich soil of Mesopotamia. The most profound of all their inventions was undoubtedly the wheel. We've mentioned it briefly, but its impact is difficult to overstate. The earliest evidence of wheeled vehicles comes from Mesopotamia, specifically from the city of Uruk, dating back to around 3500 BCE. Before the wheel, everything had to be carried by hand, on the backs of animals, or dragged on sledges. The wheel revolutionized transportation, allowing for the easy movement of heavy goods and people. It transformed agriculture with the invention of the wheelbarrow and the potter's wheel. The potter's wheel, in particular, allowed for the mass production of uniform pottery, which was essential for storing and transporting surplus food. The invention of the wheel was a game changer, a technological leap that literally set the world in motion. Another invention that was just as important and perhaps less celebrated was the plow. Before the plow, farmers had to prepare their fields by hand, a back-breaking and slow process. The invention of the plow, pulled by oxen or donkeys, allowed a farmer to till a much larger area of land in a fraction of the time. This increased agricultural output, which in turn led to a greater surplus of food. It was this surplus that allowed for the growth of cities and the specialization of labor. Where not everyone had to be a farmer, some people could become scribes or artisans or soldiers. The plow was not just a tool, it was the engine that powered the urban revolution. The Mesopotamians also made incredible advances in metallurgy, the science of working with metals. They were among the first people in the world to master the art of smelting copper and tin to create bronze. Bronze was a far superior material to stone or copper. It was harder, more durable, and could be cast into a variety of shapes. This led to a revolution in tool-making and warfare. Bronze tools were more efficient for farming and construction. Bronze weapons, like swords and spearheads, gave the Mesopotamian armies a significant advantage over their enemies. The Bronze Age is named for this technological leap, and Mesopotamia was at its very heart. But it was in the field of writing and communication that Mesopotamia truly excelled. We've discussed cuneiform as a way of recording information, but we should also marvel at the system itself. Cuneiform was a flexible and adaptable writing system. While it started as a way to record economic transactions, it quickly evolved to express a full range of human thought. It was used to write laws, epic poems, medical texts, and diplomatic correspondence. The Mesopotamians also developed the envelope, not made of paper, but of clay. A clay tablet would be inscribed with a message, then wrapped in a thin layer of wet clay, which was also inscribed and then baked. This ensured the privacy and security of a message, as the recipient would have to break the outer shell to read the inner tablet. It was an ingenious solution to a practical problem. The Mesopotamians were also masters of engineering and architecture. Lacking stone, they relied on mud brick, but they were not limited by it. They developed the arch and the vault, architectural elements that allowed them to create large open spaces without the need for internal columns. They also built vast and complex irrigation systems, including canals, dams, and reservoirs. These systems were a testament to their civil engineering skills and required a level of social organization and cooperation that was unprecedented. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, for example, built a massive aqueduct to bring water to his capital city of Nineveh. This aqueduct was a marvel of ancient engineering, a multi-arched bridge that carried water for miles, a precursor to the Roman aqueducts that are so famous today. Perhaps the most astonishing of all their innovations was their contribution to mathematics and astronomy. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, was a brilliant invention. It allowed them to perform complex calculations in algebra and geometry. The famous Plimpton 322 tablet, for example, contains a list of Pythagorean triples, 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Their understanding of geometry allowed them to measure fields, calculate the volume of a granary, and design their monumental buildings. Their work in astronomy was even more profound. They saw the night sky as a great cosmic clock, a way to track the passage of time and to understand the will of the gods. They kept meticulous records of celestial events over centuries, which allowed them to predict eclipses and the movements of the planets with remarkable accuracy. They were the first to identify and name the 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They divided the year into 12 months and the month into 4 weeks. Their system of dividing a day into 24 hours and an hour into 60 minutes is the system we still use today. When you look at your watch, you are, in a very real sense, looking at a legacy of the ancient Mesopotamians. Their innovations were not just for the elite. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life. The people of Mesopotamia were not just subjects of kings and worshippers of gods. They were the farmers who used the plow, the builders who laid the mud bricks, the artisans who shaped the clay, and the scribes who wrote the laws. Their genius was in their ability to solve the practical problems of their world, to create a better life for themselves, and in doing so, to lay the groundwork for a world that was yet to come. They showed that true progress comes not just from military might or political power, but from the quiet, persistent work of invention and discovery. This is a story of a civilization that, with its ingenuity, built not just empires, but a legacy of technology and science that has stood the test of time, a legacy that continues to shape our lives in ways we never even think to question. As the final grains of sand fall through the hourglass of ancient history, our story of Mesopotamia would be incomplete without a deeper look at the people themselves, not just as a collective society, but as individuals with their own lives, their own joys, and their own sorrows. We have spoken of kings and priests, but what was it like to be an ordinary person in this land of firsts? This is a journey into the rhythm of daily life, into the homes and hearts of the people who built this remarkable civilization. Life for most Mesopotamians, especially in the earliest periods, was inextricably linked to the family and the home. The family unit was the cornerstone of society, and a person's identity was defined by their place within it. The typical home was a simple mud brick structure, often built around a central courtyard. The roof was flat, used for sleeping on hot summer nights and for drying crops and goods. The inside was sparse, with simple furniture and a clay oven for baking bread, a staple of their diet. The family was patriarchal, with the father as the head of the household, responsible for his family's well-being and honor. But the mother's role was also crucial. She managed the home, raised the children, and was often involved in domestic crafts like weaving and pottery. Children from a young age were taught the skills they would need to survive, whether it was working in the fields or learning a craft. The life of a farmer, the vast majority of the population, was one of constant hard labor. They toiled in the fields, planting barley and wheat, and maintaining the intricate network of irrigation canals. The work was demanding and seasonal. The spring planting and the summer harvest were periods of intense communal activity. Life was lived at the pace of the sun and the seasons, and their survival was dependent on the generosity of the rivers and the whims of the gods. But life wasn't just a grind. There were festivals and religious ceremonies, which provided a break from the daily routine and a chance for the community to come together. These celebrations often involved feasting, music, and storytelling, a way to pass on their rich mythology and history. For those who lived in the cities, life was different. The city was a place of specialization and commerce. The city was divided into distinct neighborhoods, with different quarters for artisans, merchants, and the wealthy elite. The marketplace was the center of social and economic life, a bustling, noisy place where people would barter for goods from all over the known world. Merchants traded in everything from grain and wool to exotic goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedar wood from Lebanon. Money, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, people used a system of bartering and a standard of value based on a unit of weight of silver or barley. The transactions were often recorded on clay tablets, a testament to the importance of the scribes and a written record. The people of Mesopotamia were also deeply concerned with health and medicine. They believed that illness was often caused by demons or the displeasure of the gods, but they also had a sophisticated understanding of herbal remedies and surgical procedures. Doctors, known as asyu, were highly respected, and their practices were governed by a strict code of ethics, as laid out in the Code of Hammurabi. They performed surgery, set broken bones, and prepared herbal medicines. Alongside them were the ashipu, or exorcists, who used magical spells and rituals to drive out the evil spirits believed to be causing the illness. It was a holistic view of medicine, one that addressed both the physical symptoms and the perceived spiritual cause. In the realm of education and learning, Mesopotamia was a pioneer. While the vast majority of the population was illiterate, the scribes' schools, or edaba, were a significant part of urban life. The curriculum was rigorous and lasted for years. A student known as the son of the tablet house would spend their days copying out cuneiform signs, practicing multiplication tables, and studying the classics of Sumerian and Akkadian literature. The goal was to train the next generation of administrators, priests, and scholars. The schools fostered a love of knowledge and a deep respect for intellectual pursuits, which led to the many scientific and literary achievements of the civilization. For the Mesopotamians, entertainment and leisure were also important. They loved music and dance, which were a central part of religious ceremonies and private celebrations. The lyre, the harp, and the drum were common instruments. They enjoyed board games, including a game similar to checkers that was found in the royal tombs of Ur. They told jokes and riddles, and of course, they loved their stories. The myths and legends of the gods and heroes like Gilgamesh were not just religious texts. They were a form of entertainment, a way to pass the time and to connect with their cultural heritage. The people of Mesopotamia were not so different from us. They loved their families, they worked hard, they sought joy and meaning in their lives, and they faced their challenges with a remarkable sense of resilience and ingenuity. They lived in a world of harsh realities, but they created a culture of incredible richness and complexity. Their daily lives were a testament to the human spirit, a spirit that built cities from mud and created stories from the stars. It is in these details, in the rhythm of their daily existence, that we can truly see the heart of this ancient and remarkable civilization. The story of Mesopotamia is a reminder that even in a world that is distant in time and space, the fundamental human experiences remain the same. The hopes and fears of a Mesopotamian farmer are not so different from our own. The love of a parent for a child, the pride of a craftsman in their work, the joy of a community coming together. These are universal feelings that transcend the millennia. And it is this connection, this shared humanity, that makes their story so powerful and so deeply resonant even today. As you lie in a state of deep relaxation, we turn the final pages of this grand historical epic. Our last chapters have focused on the details of daily life, but to truly conclude our story, we must look at how the entire civilization, the kings, the gods, the people, and their inventions, came to be remembered, or for a long time, forgotten. This is the story of the lost world of Mesopotamia and its rediscovery, a tale that bridges the ancient past with our modern present. Following its integration into the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the later conquests by Alexander the Great, Mesopotamia's unique cultural identity slowly began to fade. The ancient languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, were no longer spoken. The complex cuneiform script was replaced by the simpler alphabetic script of Aramaic, which had become the common language of the entire Near East. The great cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, once bustling metropolises, were abandoned. their mud brick buildings and ziggurats slowly dissolving back into the desert landscape. The magnificent palaces of the Assyrian kings were buried under mounds of earth. The ancient myths and gods were largely forgotten, replaced by the new deities of the Greek and Roman world, and later by the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For over 1,000 years, the story of Mesopotamia was a blank page in the book of history. The region was a province of successive empires: the Seleucids, the Parthians, the Romans, the Sasanian Persians, and finally the Islamic caliphates. Scholars and historians of the time knew of the names of some of the great Mesopotamian cities from biblical and classical sources, but they had no idea of the scale or significance of the civilization that had created them. Babylon was a name from the Old Testament, a city of myth and legend. The Assyrians were a feared and brutal people from the Bible, but the ruins of their empire were a mystery. The Sumerians were a people entirely unknown to the world. Then, in the 19th century, a new age of exploration and discovery began. European adventurers, diplomats, and archaeologists, fueled by a spirit of adventure and a fascination with the ancient world, began to travel to the Middle East. They were often looking for biblical sites, for physical evidence to support the stories of the Old Testament. What they found, however, was something far more profound. The great breakthrough began with the excavations of two British archaeologists, Austin Henry Layard and Paul Emile Botta. In the 1840s, they began to excavate a series of large mounds, or tells, in what is now northern Iraq. Botta first began digging in a mound he thought was the ancient city of Nineveh, but which turned out to be the Assyrian capital of Khorsabad. Layard, meanwhile, excavated the mound of Nimrud, the ancient capital of Assyria, and later, the real Nineveh. What they uncovered was astonishing. They found the massive stone-carved reliefs that had decorated the Assyrian palaces, depicting scenes of lions' hunts and military conquests. They found colossal winged bull statues known as lamassu that had once guarded the palace entrances. These discoveries were a sensation in Europe, and they brought the long-forgotten Assyrians back to life. But the greatest discovery of all came from Layard's excavations at Nineveh. In 1849, he uncovered a room in the palace of King Ashurbanipal that was filled from floor to ceiling with clay tablets. This was the great library of Ashurbanipal, and it was a treasure trove of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The tablets contained a vast collection of texts, from royal annals to historical documents, from medical texts to astronomical observations, and most importantly, from great literary works, including a complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The discovery of the Gilgamesh epic, with its story of a great flood that predated the biblical account, was a stunning revelation that challenged the prevailing views of history. The problem, however, was that no one could read the writing on the tablets. The cuneiform script had been dead for over 2,000 years, and its secrets were lost. The tablets were sent back to the British Museum, where a team of scholars began the painstaking work of trying to decipher the strange, wedge-shaped writing. The key to cracking the code was an inscription found not in Mesopotamia, but in Persia. It was the Behistun inscription, a massive relief carved into a cliffside by the Persian king Darius the Great. The inscription told the same story in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The Old Persian script was already partially understood, and the Assyrian and Babylonian scripts were very similar. By using the Old Persian text as a key, a brilliant British scholar named Henry Rawlinson was able to slowly but surely decipher the Babylonian cuneiform. He was the Rosetta Stone for Mesopotamia, and his work allowed the ancient world to speak to the modern world for the first time. The decipherment of cuneiform was a turning point. It unlocked the entire history of Mesopotamia. The dusty clay tablets, once silent and mysterious, began to tell their stories. Historians and archaeologists were now able to read about the Sumerians, a people whose existence had been completely unknown. They learned about their great inventions, their city-states, and their language. They read about the great kings of Akkad and the glorious reign of Hammurabi of Babylon. They were able to piece together the entire history of a civilization that had been lost to time. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia fundamentally changed our understanding of human history. We had always thought that our civilization began with the Greeks and Romans, but now we knew that a much older and more profound story had taken place in the land between the rivers. We learned that the very foundations of our world, the city, the law, writing, and the wheel, were all invented by the people of Mesopotamia. The legacy of this rediscovery is immense. It gave us a new perspective on our own history, showing us that we are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back for thousands of years. It showed us that ideas and innovations, once created, can endure even when the civilizations that create them vanish. The story of Mesopotamia is a powerful reminder that history is not just a linear progression, but a deep, interconnected web, and that the echoes of the past are all around us, waiting to be heard. So, as we bring our journey to a close, let the echoes of this ancient land fade into the peaceful silence. The whispers of kings and the rustle of the wind across the ancient ruins have told their tale. The world of Mesopotamia, once lost, is now found, and its story is a part of our own. Rest now in the knowledge that you have journeyed to the dawn of time, and that the great cradle of civilization is now a quiet memory, lulling you into a deep and restful sleep. As our journey through the land between the rivers draws to a close, and the whispers of history grow fainter, we must now delve into the final echoes of this magnificent civilization. This is a story not of grand empires or brilliant inventions, but of the long-lasting and sometimes surprising influence of Mesopotamia on our modern world. This is where the ancient past connects directly to your present, showing that the legacy of this lost world is not confined to dusty museums, but is woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. Let's begin with the most fundamental and enduring legacy, the way we measure time. Take a moment to look at your watch. Notice the 60 minutes in an hour and the 60 seconds in a minute. This system, which is so universal and ingrained that we never question it, is a direct inheritance from the ancient Babylonians. Their sophisticated sexagesimal system, or base 60 system, was used for a variety of mathematical and astronomical calculations. The number 60 was an excellent choice because it is easily divisible by many other numbers, making it ideal for a system of measurement. While the concept of the 24-hour day comes from the Egyptians, the division of the hour and the minute is pure Mesopotamian genius. The fact that a mathematical system from over 4,000 years ago is still used on every clock and watch on the planet is a testament to its elegance and utility. The Babylonian legacy is also in the night sky. When you look at the constellations in the darkness, you are often seeing the same patterns that the Mesopotamian astronomers charted thousands of years ago. The Babylonians were the first to divide the ecliptic, the sun's apparent path through the heavens, into 12 sections, creating the zodiac signs we still use today. They named these constellations after animals and heroes, and they believed that the movements of the planets through them held a profound influence on human life. While we now see astrology as a pseudoscience, its roots are in the rigorous astronomical observations of the Babylonians. Their detailed star catalogues and their ability to predict celestial events were so advanced that they were used by later Greek and Roman astronomers for centuries. The Mesopotamian influence extends into the very foundation of our legal systems. We have talked about the Code of Hammurabi as a groundbreaking legal document. Its importance goes beyond just its content. The idea that a body of laws should be written down, publicly displayed, and applied to all citizens, even with its social stratification, was a revolutionary concept. It established the principle that a society should be governed by a uniform legal code rather than by the arbitrary whims of a ruler. This concept of the rule of law, the idea that the law is supreme and applies equally to all, is a cornerstone of our modern legal traditions. The Code of Hammurabi was the first step on a long road that eventually led to the development of legal systems around the world. But the legacy is also in our stories and myths. We've discussed the parallels between the Mesopotamian flood myth and the biblical story of Noah, but the connection runs deeper. Many of the great myths and narratives of the ancient world, including those in the Bible, have their origins in Mesopotamia. The creation stories, the tales of paradise lost, and the stories of heroes and divine intervention, all of these themes were explored in Mesopotamian literature long before they appeared in other traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its hero's search for immortality and his encounter with the sole survivor of a great flood, is a powerful example of how these ancient narratives laid the groundwork for the foundational stories of our own cultures. Even our language holds echoes of this ancient world. The very idea of the alphabet, while not a Mesopotamian invention, was a development that built upon the concept of a written script. The Phoenicians, who developed the first true alphabet, traded extensively with the Mesopotamians and were likely influenced by their system of writing. The spread of Aramaic, a language that used a simple alphabet throughout the Persian Empire, which had Mesopotamia as its core, led to its use as the basis for later alphabets, including the one you are reading now. The Mesopotamians also gave us the very idea of a city. The city-state was their invention, a form of social and political organization that laid the groundwork for all later empires and nations. They were the first people to live in large, permanent urban settlements, and they were the first to grapple with the complex problems that come with urban life: law and order, public works, sanitation, and social stratification. The modern city, with its specialized labor and complex social structures, is a direct descendant of the Sumerian city-states. So as we bring our journey to a final peaceful end, let us remember that the history of Mesopotamia is not a distant, forgotten chapter. It is a living, breathing part of our world. It is in the way we count our minutes, the way we tell our stories, and the way we organize our societies. The people of the land between the rivers, with their ingenuity and their tireless quest for knowledge and order, created a world that, in many ways, is still our own. Their legacy is a testament to the power of human innovation and the enduring nature of great ideas. Let the whispers of the past now fade completely, and let the gentle rhythm of the night lull you into a deep and peaceful sleep. You have traveled to the dawn of time, and in doing so, you have found that the ancient world is not so far away after all. Rest now, and dream of a world of clay tablets and great ziggurats, a world that is now a part of your own peaceful rest. As our journey into the quiet, starlit past of Mesopotamia reaches its final peaceful moments, we must take a step back from the grand sweep of history and the remarkable details of daily life. This final chapter is a reflection, a quiet contemplation of what we have learned and what it means for us here in the modern world. This is not about new information, but about a deeper understanding, a sense of perspective that only a long, quiet journey through time can provide. We began our story in a wild, untamed land between two rivers, a place of harsh sun and life-giving water. We saw how a few simple, revolutionary ideas, the decision to stop wandering and to start planting, laid the groundwork for everything that was to follow. From the humble beginnings of agriculture came the first villages, then the first cities, like Uruk, a bustling metropolis that was a marvel of the ancient world. We watched as kings rose to power, their might and piety reflected in the towering ziggurats and the sprawling palaces. We saw the rise and fall of empires, the Sumerian city-states, the world-conquering Akkadians, the magnificent old Babylonians under Hammurabi, the brutal but brilliant Assyrians, and the final glorious flourish of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, each one built upon the one before it, a testament to the cyclical nature of power and the resilience of human civilization. But our journey was more than just a list of kings and battles. We went deeper into the heart of their society. We saw that the people of Mesopotamia were not so different from us. They were farmers and craftsmen, scribes and merchants, mothers and fathers. They loved their families, they worked hard for a living, and they celebrated their lives with music, feasting, and storytelling. We explored their belief system, a world filled with powerful, often capricious gods who demanded respect and ritual. Their myths, with their themes of creation, destruction, and a hero's search for meaning, were a profound way to make sense of a difficult world. They believed that humanity's purpose was to serve the gods and to bring order to a chaotic cosmos, a belief that gave them a sense of purpose and meaning. We also marveled at their extraordinary ingenuity. This was a civilization of firsts, the first to invent writing, the wheel, the plough, and the city-state. They gave us the principles of law, a system for dividing time, and a way to understand the movements of the stars. The mathematics they developed is still with us, hidden in the seconds on our clocks and the degrees in our circles. Their art, from the intricate cylinder seals to the monumental stone reliefs, was a powerful way to communicate their values and to immortalize their history. They were not just conquerors or builders, they were scientists, artists, and storytellers. They showed us that progress comes not just from military might, but from the quiet, persistent work of invention and discovery. The final act of our story was about loss and rediscovery. We saw how this magnificent civilization faded into memory, its cities buried, its language forgotten. But then, in a dramatic twist of fate, it was brought back to life by the tireless work of 19th century archaeologists and scholars. The decipherment of cuneiform was a turning point, a moment when the silent past began to speak to us again. The story of Mesopotamia, once a blank page in the book of history, was filled in, and in doing so, it changed our understanding of ourselves. It showed us that we are the inheritors of a tradition far older than we ever imagined, a tradition that began in the sun-baked plains of a land between two rivers. So, as we bring this final chapter to a close, let's take a moment to reflect. This journey has not just been a history lesson, it has been a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The people of Mesopotamia faced challenges that were unimaginable to us: floods, famines, and constant warfare. But they met these challenges with courage, cooperation, and an unwavering belief in their ability to build a better world. They showed that even in the face of great difficulty, it is possible to create something magnificent and lasting. Their legacy is not just in the objects we find in museums, but in the very foundations of our civilization. It is a testament to the power of human ingenuity, the importance of community, and the timeless search for meaning and order. Now, as the long story of Mesopotamia fades into the silence of the night, let the final whispers guide you to a place of complete rest. The journey is over, the knowledge is yours, and the peaceful, enduring quiet of the ancient world is here to lull you into a deep and tranquil sleep. You have walked with the gods and kings of the dawn of time, and in doing so, you have found a place of profound peace within yourself. Good night.